In 1945, World War II ended. The world had finally escaped the bloodiest conflict in history, but what came next was not peace, it was fear. Two nations stood taller than the rest, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Both had won the war, but both wanted to rule the future. America believed in democracy, freedom, and capitalism, a world where people could choose their leaders and build their own future. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, believed in communism, a system where the government controlled everything to keep everyone equal. At first, they were allies, but soon, their friendship turned to suspicion. Each saw the other as a threat. Each wanted to spread its own way of life across the world. After the war, Europe was destroyed, cities lay in ruins, families had nothing, and governments were collapsing. The United States launched the Marshall Plan, a program to send money and supplies to rebuild Western Europe. It was not only about helping, it was also about stopping communism from spreading. Stalin saw this as a trap. He refused to let any country under Soviet control take that help. Instead, he tightened his grip on Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany all came under Soviet control. A line had been drawn across Europe. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it the Iron Curtain, dividing the free West from the communist East. In 1947, US President Harry Truman announced that America would help any country threatened by communism. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, the official start of the Cold War. America began to see the world as a battlefield between freedom and control. The Soviet Union saw it as a fight between revolution and capitalism. Both started building alliances, arming nations, and spreading propaganda. The world was no longer united. It was split into two camps. Omanau Sprandla. Onina, on the Brunau Sprinefrial, bombarded by Washington, the other by Moscow. Berlin, the capital of Germany, became the first real test of this new rivalry. Although Berlin was deep inside Soviet territory, it had been divided into four parts after the war, controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the USSR. In 1948, Stalin tried to take full control. He blocked all roads and railways leading to West Berlin, hoping to starve the city into surrender. Instead of giving up, America and its allies began the Berlin Airlift, a daring mission to fly supplies into the city. For almost a year, planes landed every few minutes, carrying food, medicine, and fuel to the people trapped inside. After 11 long months, Stalin ended the blockade. The Western Allies had proven they would not back down. In 1945, only America had the atomic bomb. That gave it enormous power and confidence. But in 1949, the Soviet Union shocked the world by testing its own atomic bomb. The balance of power changed overnight. Now, both sides had weapons capable of wiping out humanity. Fear spread everywhere. Children practiced nuclear drills at school, hiding under desks. Families built underground shelters. The world entered the nuclear age. An age where one mistake could end everything. The first real war of the Cold War began in 1950, not in Europe, but in Asia. After World War II, Korea had been divided into two parts, the North, supported by the Soviet Union, and the South, supported by the United States. In June 1950, North Korea invaded the South. The United Nations, led by the US, stepped in to defend South Korea. For 3 years, brutal fighting followed. Cities were burned, millions died, and the world watched nervously, afraid that this could lead to World War III. In the end, neither side won. The war stopped in 1953, but the border remained where it started, near the 38th parallel. The Korean War showed that the Cold War could turn deadly at any moment. In March 1953, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died after nearly 30 years of brutal rule. Inside the Soviet Union, a struggle for power began. Some hoped this might bring peace with the West, but mistrust ran too deep. The world had already been divided, not by walls or borders, but by fear. The Cold War had only just begun. Both sides now stood ready to fight, not just with bombs or bullets, but with ideas, technology, spies, and influence. The next decade would decide which system could power in Natsin Sadanan Ande, Tenatsker, Tensaver Aperber Dauber, Tembarber, Entador Dad Reed, Idnatsen Ford Dan and Einbaden Daster, We trud gom and bomb and ban mawar di dine dak son my did son den bobser. The connects to dine da would shape the future of the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 brought a short breath of hope. Many believed that maybe, just maybe, the Cold War would calm down, but peace never came. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was far too deep, and the world was about to enter its most dangerous decade. After Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power in the Soviet Union. He promised a softer approach compared to Stalin's cruelty, but he also wanted to prove that communism was stronger than capitalism. He famously declared, "We will bury you," a message aimed directly at the West. At the same time in America, President Dwight D. Eisenhower focused on building military power and preventing the spread of communism. Both men wanted to avoid direct war, but neither was willing to back down. By the mid-1950s, both nations were building nuclear weapons faster than ever before. Each test was bigger, louder, and more destructive. The United States created the hydrogen bomb, thousands of times stronger than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviet Union quickly followed. The logic was simple and terrifying. If both sides had enough bombs to destroy the world, neither would dare to use them. This became known as mutually assured destruction, or simply, MAD. The world lived under constant fear. One wrong decision, one wrong signal, and everything could end in minutes. In 1957, the Cold War reached the sky. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was a tiny metal sphere, but its impact was enormous. For the first time, mankind had entered space, and it was the Soviets who got there first. In America, the news caused panic. If the USSR could send a satellite into orbit, they could also launch missiles from space. The United States responded by creating NASA in 1958 and investing billions into science and technology. What began as a military competition had turned into a space race, a fight to prove which system could lead humanity into the future. As both powers built bombs and rockets, another silent war was being fought, the war of spies. The CIA in America and the KGB in the Soviet Union sent agents across the globe, stealing secrets, influencing governments, and spreading propaganda. In 1960, a U.S. spy plane called the U-2 was shot down over Soviet territory. The American pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. The Soviets used it as proof that America was spying on them from the sky. The U-2 incident destroyed what little trust remained. Khrushchev walked out of peace talks with Eisenhower, and the Cold War grew colder than ever before. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed government in Cuba. At first, America hoped to bring him closer to the West, but soon Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. For the first time, communism had reached the doorstep of the United States. Cuba became a close Soviet ally, just 90 miles away from Florida. The US government was furious. In 1961, it supported a failed invasion called the Bay of Pigs, where Cuban exiles tried to overthrow Castro. The invasion ended in disaster, and it pushed Cuba even closer to Moscow. In the early 1960s, Berlin once again became the center of Cold War tension. People from communist East Germany were escaping in huge numbers to the west, seeking freedom. Khrushchev could not allow this humiliation to continue. In 1961, he gave the order to build a wall. Overnight, soldiers and workers began constructing a barrier through the heart of Berlin. Families were divided, friends separated, and the Berlin Wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War. The message was clear: the world was divided, and the line could no longer be crossed. If the Cold War had a breaking point, it came in October 1962. The Soviet Union secretly sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. When American spy planes discovered them, the world froze. For 13 terrifying days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the edge of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy demanded that the missiles be removed. Soviet ships carrying more missiles sailed toward Cuba while American warships surrounded the island. The world waited, hour by hour, to see who would make the first move. Then, at the last moment, both sides stepped back. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, the US promised not to invade the island. Secretly, America also agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. It was the closest humanity ever came to ending itself. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. Both sides realized how close they had come to total destruction. A direct phone line, known as the hotline, was set up between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. But the rivalry was far from over. The arms race continued. The space race After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world had stepped back from the edge of nuclear war. Both the United States and the Soviet Union realized how dangerous their rivalry had become. But instead of ending the conflict, they changed their strategy. From this point on, the Cold War would not be fought directly. It would be fought through proxy wars, espionage, and global influence. In the early 1960s, a small country in Southeast Asia became the next major battlefield, Vietnam. Like Korea before it, Vietnam was divided into two parts: North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States. The North wanted to unite the country under communism, the South wanted to remain free and democratic. In 1965, the US sent hundreds of thousands of troops to stop communism from spreading. But the war was brutal. The jungles of Vietnam became a nightmare. Endless rain, traps, and guerrilla fighters who could strike and vanish. Despite its technology and weapons, America struggled to win. Television brought the horrors of war into every American home. Burning villages, helicopters falling, and soldiers lost in a war that made no sense. By the early 1970s, the US had lost more than 50,000 soldiers. The war divided America itself. Protests erupted in every major city. In 1973, US troops finally withdrew, and in 1975, Saigon fell to communist forces. For the Soviet Union, it was a symbolic victory. For America, it was a painful wound that shook its confidence for years. While soldiers fought on Earth, the Cold War also continued in space. The Soviet Union had led the early race: first satellite, first man, first spacewalk, but the United States was determined to go further. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy made a bold promise. America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended. It took 8 years, billions of dollars, and thousands of scientists. But on July 20, 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong took the first step on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The United States had won the space race. For the first time, humanity looked at Earth from afar, a small, fragile blue world caught between two superpowers. By the early 1970s, both America and the Soviet Union were tired of war, fear, and constant tension. The cost of maintaining nuclear weapons and global influence was crushing both economies. A new era began, known as détente, a French word meaning relaxation of tensions. Leaders from both sides started talking again. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Moscow in 1972, the first American president ever to do so. He also visited China, which had broken away from Soviet influence, creating a new balance of power. Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed the Salt-White Treaty, limiting the number of nuclear missiles both sides could have. It was a rare moment of cooperation during decades of rivalry. But beneath the smiles and handshakes, suspicion still lingered. Both sides continued to build weapons, fund spies, and fight smaller wars through other countries. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War spread to every corner of the world. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, revolutions and coups were fueled by American and Soviet money. In Chile, the CIA supported the overthrow of a socialist president. In Angola and Ethiopia, the Soviets sent weapons and advisors to support communist forces. In Afghanistan, the seeds of a future conflict were already being planted. The two superpowers fought not with their own soldiers, but with influence, by training, arming, and funding others. The world became a chessboard, and every country was a potential piece in the game. Beyond the battlefields, spies were everywhere. The CIA and KGB were at the peak of their power, stealing nuclear secrets, turning double agents, and using technology to listen from the shadows. Stories of betrayal became legends. Soviet spies infiltrated Western governments. American agents worked inside Moscow, risking everything. Even ordinary citizens became caught in the paranoia. Neighbors suspected neighbors, and anyone could be accused of being a spy. This silent war of information was just as deadly as any fought with guns. In 1973, a global oil crisis hit the world. Prices soared, economies weakened, and people began to question whether their governments could protect them. The Soviet Union used its vast oil and gas resources as a weapon, supplying its allies and pressuring its enemies. Meanwhile, in the US, inflation and unemployment rose, creating anger and mistrust among citizens. Both powers seemed unstoppable from the outside, but inside, cracks were beginning to form. By the late 1970s, the brief period of calm was fading. New conflicts were rising again, and this time, they were even closer to the Soviet border. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support its communist government. To Moscow, it seemed like another step in expanding influence. To Washington, it was proof that the Soviets were still trying to dominate the world. The invasion of Afghanistan would become one of the biggest turning points in the entire Cold War. And a new and final chapter was about to begin. By the late 1970s, the world had changed, but the shadow of the Cold War was still everywhere. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were exhausted, but neither was willing to give up. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the balance of power began to shift one last time. The Soviet leadership believed Afghanistan would be a quick victory, a simple mission to support a friendly communist government, but they were wrong. The rugged mountains of Afghanistan turned into a graveyard for their armies. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, resisted with courage and determination. The United States saw an opportunity. Through the CIA, it began secretly sending weapons, training, and money to Afghan fighters. It became a brutal proxy war, Soviet helicopters against American-supplied missiles. For nearly a decade, the Soviets were trapped in a war they couldn't win. Thousands of soldiers died, and back home, people began to question the purpose of the conflict. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. He brought with him a new, aggressive stance against communism. Reagan believed that the Soviet Union was not just a rival, it was an evil empire. Under his leadership, America began a massive military buildup. New weapons, new technology, and new alliances were formed. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, aimed to build a space-based missile defense system. It frightened the Soviet leadership. They simply could not keep up with America's growing technology and spending. Reagan's speeches inspired people across the world who were living under oppression.
He called on Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Those words would become the symbol of the end that was coming. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was facing serious internal problems. Its economy was collapsing, factories were outdated, food shortages were common, and people had lost faith in their government. Corruption spread everywhere, and the military drained what little money was left. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he realized something had to change. Fast. He introduced two new ideas. Perestroika, restructuring, to reform the failing economy. Glasnost, openness, to allow freedom of speech and transparency. For the first time in Soviet history, citizens could criticize the government without fear of prison. It was revolutionary, but dangerous. Once people began to speak, they started demanding more freedom. Gorbachev's reforms inspired movements all across Eastern Europe. In Poland, workers formed the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, demanding democracy. In Hungary, borders were opened. In Czechoslovakia, peaceful protests filled the streets. And in East Germany, people began to gather at the Berlin Wall, chanting for freedom. The Soviet Union could have used tanks and guns to crush these uprisings, as it had in the past, but Gorbachev refused. He would not send troops to stop people from choosing their own path. This one decision changed history forever. On November 9, 1989, a rumor spread across East Berlin. The border was open. Thousands of people ran to the Berlin Wall. Soldiers, confused and overwhelmed, didn't know what to do. And then, someone began to climb. Crowds cheered. Hammers struck the concrete. Piece by piece, the wall that had divided a city and the world for nearly 3 decades began to fall. Families were reunited. Tears, laughter, and music filled the cold night air. It wasn't just the fall of a wall, it was the fall of fear itself. After the wall fell, the dominoes began to fall with it. One by one, communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed. In Moscow, the Soviet republics, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and many others, began demanding independence. By 1991, the once mighty Soviet Union was breaking apart from within. Economy in ruins, military demoralized, people desperate for change. In December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag, with its hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rose the flag of Russia. After nearly half a century of rivalry, tension, and fear, the Cold War was over. The world that emerged was changed forever. The United States stood as the only superpower, Democracy and capitalism spread rapidly, but so did new challenges: terrorism, economic crises, and global uncertainty. The Cold War had ended without nuclear destruction, but it left behind a legacy of spies, secrets, and scars that still shape the modern world. Final words. From 1947 to 1991, for 44 years, the world lived under the shadow of two great powers. It was an age of fear and hope, of wars and revolutions, of heroes and betrayal. In the end, it wasn't weapons that ended the Cold War. It was the courage of ordinary people who demanded freedom. The Cold War didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper, and the sound of walls falling.